The neon-lit sky shimmered with hues of violet and blue as Karen, a rugged human traveler, stepped off his ship onto the soft bioluminescent sand of Viscera, an exotic alien trade outpost orbiting a dying star. He had seen many worlds, many races, but nothing quite like this place. Towering crystalline structures hummed with unseen energy, while exotic merchants with scaled hands and translucent eyes bartered with off-worlders over goods ranging from rare minerals to strange pulsing organic artifacts. The scent in the air was thick with spice, ozone, and something sweetly intoxicating. Karen was here for a simple trade or so, he thought, but fate had different plans. A pair of slitted golden eyes watched him from the shadows of a nearby marketplace stall, unblinking, studying his every movement. The figure moved gracefully, almost predatory yet with an air of mystery. Karen was unaware of her presence until she spoke. Human, a silky, almost hypnotic voice murmured from behind him. He turned sharply, his muscles instinctively tensing. Before him stood a woman unlike any he had ever seen. She was tall and elegant, her figure wrapped in flowing silver fabric that barely hid the tone curves of her body. Her skin was an iridescent sapphire blue, shimmering under the glow of the neon marketplace. A long, sinuous tail curled behind her, twitching in silent anticipation, but it was her eyes' burning gold-slit pupil, filled with an emotion he couldn't yet place, that truly caught his attention. Karen raised a brow. "You know what I am?" A small smirk played on her full lips. "I do." She took a step closer, the air between them thickening. "I've been watching you." Something about her voice sent a through him. It was not just curiosity, it was hunger. Karen had spent years traveling the stars, but he had never encountered an alien woman who looked at him quite like this. "That's not usually a good thing," he muttered, keeping his tone casual, but his guard raised it. "If you want it to be," she countered, tilting her head. Her gaze drifted lower, tracing his form, as if assessing his worth, his strength, his capability. Karen chuckled dryly. "And what exactly do you want?" She exhaled slowly, almost as if tasting his scent in the air. Then, in a voice low and sultry, she whispered, "To offer myself to you." Karen blinked, sure he had misheard. "Excuse me." Zara's expression remained unreadable, but there was an unmistakable intensity in her voice. "I will not ask again." Human, she took another step closer, her breath warm against his skin. "I want to know what it feels like to be taken by a human." Karen wasn't easily rattled, but this was new. "And why exactly would you want that?" he asked, voice steady, but his pull slightly quicker than before. Zara's tail flicked behind her, and for the first time he saw a hint of uncertainty in her golden eyes. "Because no male of my kind has ever made me feel this way." Her voice was lower now, almost a confession. She licked her lips and continued, "You are different. Your scent, your form, your presence. None of my people stir my blood like this." Karen smirked, crossing his arms. "Flattering, but forgive me for saying this sounds a little sudden." Zara's pupils dilated, her breath shallow. "It is not a light request," she admitted. "In my culture, if a female allows herself to be taken from behind, it means she belongs to that male forever." Karen's smirk faded now. He understood this wasn't just some alien woman flirting with him. This was serious. Karen exhaled, his mind wearing with itself. This was a dangerous offer, one that could entangle him in alien customs he barely understood. But gods, she was tempting. Everything about her, her scent, her voice, the way she watched him, as if he was the only being in the universe that mattered, made it hard to refuse. Still, he had to be sure. "If this is a cultural thing, shouldn't you be doing this with one of your own?" Zara stepped closer, her fingers brushing against his chest, testing him. "They do not excite me," she said. "Simply you do." Her touch sent a jolt of warmth through him. "If I say yes, what happens next?" he asked, voice lower now. Zara's eyes darkened. "Then you take me," she whispered, "and I will belong to you until my last breath." The suspicion in the shadows. Before Karen could answer, he noticed movement in the corner of his eye. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stood in the shadows, watching them. The alien male's expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with barely restrained fury. Karen turned slightly, keeping Zara in his peripheral vision. "Friend of yours," he muttered. Zora's jaw tightened, and for the first time he saw a hint of fear in her expression. she said, voice clipped. He is my father's favorite warrior, and let me guess he doesn't like humans, Karen asked dryly. Zora's lips pressed into a thin line. He doesn't like competition, Karen chuckled, but there was an edge to it. Great, so I'm about to get into a fight before we even get started. Zora's hand tightened on his arm. Not here, not now. If you want me, come to the temple ruins beyond the market at moonrise. Her voice was urgent, desperate. Karen looked into her eyes. He could walk away, leave this madness behind. But he knew one thing for sure. He wanted her. Slowly, he nodded. Moonrise. Xara let out a breath of relief, pressing a slow, lingering touch to his wrist before turning and vanishing into the crowd. Karen exhaled, running a hand through his hair. What the hell had he just gotten himself into? In the shadows watched him leave, his golden eyes filled with murderous intent. The human had just made a dangerous mistake. Karen spent the next few hours wandering the trade outpost, but his mind was elsewhere. No matter how many strange creatures passed him by, no matter how many odd trinkets and weapons merchants tried to sell him, his thoughts kept circling back to her. Xara, her voice, her golden eyes, the way she spoke with such certainty, as if she had already decided he was hers. It should have set off alarm bells. It should have made him turn around and head straight back to his ship. Instead, it thrilled him. The way she had whispered to him, her voice edged with longing, haunted him, and the meaning behind her words, that was what truly made his blood run hot. Taking her from behind, he had thought it was some bold, playful request, but in her world it meant complete surrender. It meant belonging. He had encountered plenty of alien cultures in his travels, some where mating was transactional, others where it was ceremonial, and a few where it was barely more than an evolutionary function. But this was something different, something deeper, and that made it all the more dangerous. The sun of Vaser had dipped below the horizon, casting a deep violet glow over the sky. When Karen made his way toward the outskirts of the marketplace, the streets became narrower, the hum of trade fading behind him. As he reached the temple ruins, Xara had spoken of, they were ancient structures, their marble-like surfaces cracked and worn by time, the edges glowing faintly with remnants of forgotten energy. The air smelled of something rich and earthy, tinged with an aroma he could only describe as her scent. She was already waiting for him. Xara stood at the base of a crumbling pillar, her silver garment catching the dim glow of the moons above. But something about her was different now. She looked tense, her fingers curled into her palms, her tail flicking with agitation. Karen approached slowly, keeping his voice even. You look like someone who's having second thoughts. Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time she seemed uncertain. Not second thoughts, she murmured, but you must understand, if we do this, I am yours. You will be my only. There was something almost vulnerable in her voice. Karen exhaled, stepping closer. And you're sure you want that? Her breath hitched as his fingers brushed against her wrist, his touch light but deliberate. He could feel her pulse quicken. More than I have ever wanted anything. A slow, deliberate silence stretched between them, her golden eyes locked onto his, and Karen could see it, the raw, unfiltered desire beneath the surface. But there was more than that. Beneath her there was a quiet desperation, as if this was her only chance to know what it was like to be wanted. His fingers traced up her arm. Slow testing. She didn't pull away. Then tell me why, he murmured. Why me? Xara took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling. Because I do not feel this way with my own kind. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. No male of my people stirs my blood the way you do. Karen studied her, his expression unreadable. And if we do this, you'll belong to me. Her tail wrapped around his wrist, a subconscious movement. Yes. He exhaled sharply, tilting his head. And your people, your warrior friend, who was glaring at me earlier. Her pupils narrowed at the mention of her, expression darkening. He would see me taken by another of my kind. He would see me used as a duty, not as a desire. Karen could hear the bitterness in her voice, the idea of her being forced into a bond without feeling anything for the one who claimed her didn't sit right with him. Xara stepped closer, her fingers pressing against his chest. Do you know what my kind say about human males? Karen smirked. That were reckless and unpredictable. A small teasing smile played on her lips. That you are dangerous, that your kind has a fire no others have. That once a human desires, he will take what is his and nothing will stop him. Her gaze searched his face, her body nearly pressed against his now. Is that true, Karen? His fingers curled under her chin, tilting her face up to his. You tell me. Her breath hitched, her lips slightly parted. Karen had never been one to hesitate, and he wasn't about to start now. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, slow testing. Xyler shuddered, her entire body tensing as if something inside her had snapped. Then she melted against him, her fingers gripping his jacket, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, desperate and raw, her body pressing into him, as if she had been starved for this her entire life. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, she pulled away, her golden eyes blazing with something new, something wild. I need more. Karen smirked. Then take it before either of them could close the space again. A low, guttural voice shattered the moment. Step away from her, human. Karen stiffened, his muscles coiling with instinct. He turned slowly to see Kith standing just beyond the ruins, his powerful frame silhouetted against the twin moons. The alien warrior's eyes burned with fury, his hand resting on the hilt of a curved serrated blade. Sar's expression hardened. This is none of your concern. His jaw clenched. It is the concern of all our kind when you defile yourself with an offworlder. Karen sighed, rolling his shoulders. You know, I was really hoping we could get through this without someone threatening to kill me. Took a step forward. Leave now, human, or face the consequences. Zira stepped between them, her tail flicking in agitation. I have made my choice. Nostrils flared. You dishonor yourself and your bloodline. Karen could feel the weight of the moment. He knew this wasn't just about some jealous alien male. This was a challenge, and the only way it would end was with a fight. Zyra turned back to him, her voice urgent. Go now. Karen met her gaze, reading the plea in her eyes. He could run, he could leave this all behind. But as he stared into those golden, desperate eyes, he knew he wasn't walking the way she had chosen him. And he wasn't about to let her face this alone. His hand dropped to his belt, brushing against the hilt of his own blade. Karen smirked, turning back to All right, big guy. Let's dance, snarled, drawing his weapon. And just like that, the fight for Zora's future had begun. The moment unsheathed his weapon, the tension in the air became suffocating. The alien warrior's grip was tight around the hilt of his curved blade, his body poised in a battle stance, designed for speed and ality. His golden eyes glowed under the twin moons, filled with nothing but rage. Karen didn't flinch. He had been in situations like this before: back alley brawls, bar fights, near-death duels on war-torn planets. This wasn't his first dance with death. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about her. Sar's breathing was shallow, her body tense. As she looked between the two of them, Karen could feel her pulse through the air, itself fast, unsteady, filled with both fear and anticipation. Kith sneered, taking a slow step forward. You do not belong here, human. His voice was a deep growl, the sound like a low thunderstorm before the strike of lightning. Karen let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders. Neither do you. Apparently she made her choice. His tail lashed behind him in anger, the alien male baring his sharp teeth. She does not understand the weight of her decision. Karen smirked, his own hand lowering to the hilt of his combat knife, still strapped to his belt. Then I guess that's for her to decide, isn't it? Karth lunged, the blade swung fast, too fast. But Karen was already moving. He sidestepped, narrowly dodging the deadly arc as he pulled his own knife free. The clash of metal rang through the ruins as Karen blocked a second strike, his muscles straining against the alien's sheer strength. Kath's movements were brutal and relentless, the kind that came from years of warrior training, not just instinct. His strikes were meant to overwhelm, dominate, destroy. But Karen had fought faster, deadlier, and he wasn't about to lose. With a sharp twist, Karen ducked under another swipe, pivoting behind and slamming an elbow into his ribs. The alien grunted, but barely stumbled, his tail snapping out like a whip, aiming for Karen's throat. Karen barely had time to block. Zyra gasped, stepping forward. Stop this! Isk roared, cutting her off as he swung with deadly precision, his blade aimed straight for Karen's chest. Karen dodged left, but not fast enough. The serrated edge sliced across his shoulder, burning white-hot against his skin. Pain flared, but he gritted his teeth, pushing through it. Kith smirked, weak. Karen exhaled sharply, rolling his neck, his fingers tightened around his knife. That all you got? The alien smirk. Vanished. Karen charged this time. His movements were fast, brutally human. Unpredictable, he was smaller than K, but he was quicker, smarter. K tried to counter, but Karen ducked low, slicing across the warrior's thigh. A snarl of pain tore from the alien's throat. You dare? Karen didn't let him finish. With a sharp twist and pivot, he slammed the hilt of his blade into the side of K's head. The alien warrior staggered. That was all Karen needed. He pressed the tip of his knife against K's throat, breathing heavily for a long, tense moment. No one moved. The only sound was Zora's unsteady breathing. K's golden eyes burned with pure hatred, but he knew the fight was over. Karen exhaled, voice low. Walk away. The alien warrior's jaw clenched, his chest heaving. Then, with a slow, seething growl, he stepped back. Karen lowered his weapon, but he didn't turn his back. Kith spat blood onto the ground, his eyes never leaving Karen's. This is not over. Then, with one final glare at Sarah, he disappeared into the darkness of the ruins. Karen let out a breath, shaking the tension from his shoulders. His arm throbbed from the wound, but he ignored it. As he turned to Solara, her golden eyes were wide, filled with something he couldn't quite name. Awe, fear, desire. She stepped closer, her fingers hesitating before reaching out to touch the wound on his shoulder. You bled for me. Her voice was quiet, reverent. Karen smirked, wincing slightly. Yeah, well, I wasn't about to let that oversized lizard take you from me. Zora shuddered. Then, before he could react, she grabbed his face and kissed him. It wasn't soft, it wasn't slow, it was raw, desperate. Hungry. Karen groaned against her mouth, his arms pulling her closer as her body pressed flush against his. He could feel it, the fire, the desperation, the need. Her fingers dug into his hair, her breathing ragged. I am yours. Her words were a whispered vow against his lips, her hands trembling as they clung to him. Karen cooed her jaw, tilting her head up, staring into those golden eyes. He could still taste the fear, the adrenaline, the desire. Then show me. Solara let out a shaky breath. Then slowly, she took his hand in hers and led him deeper into the ruins. Solara turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she stepped closer, her fingers grazing the fabric of his shirt. No, her golden eyes locked onto his. It is the first. Karen's smirk faded. There was a sincerity in her voice, something unshakable. She meant it. Zara took a breath, her tail wrapping around his wrist, keeping him in place. You understand what this means, don't you? Karen studied her, the way she looked at him, the way she trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. He understood, and yet say it. His voice was lower now, steady, unyielding. Zara swallowed, then whispered, if you take me now, I will be yours forever. Karen exhaled sharply. Forever. This wasn't just desire, this was a surrender, a choice she had made, one that could not be undone. His fingers traced down her arm, slow, testing. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her breath hitching as his palm settled against her waist. And you're sure? He murmured. Solara let out a breath that sounded almost relieved. More sure than I have ever been about anything. There was no hesitation in her eyes, only hunger, need, devotion. Karen's hand tightened on her waist, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sar's lips parted slightly, her breath warm against his skin. Then show me. A soft gasp escaped her as he pulled her flush against him, their bodies fitting together perfectly. Zora's fingers traced over the wound on his shoulder, her touch ethereal, reverent. You bled for me. Karen smirked. I'll bleed for you again, if I have to. Her pupils dilated, something primal flashed in her golden eyes. Then, with a desperate sigh, she surrendered completely. The night stretched on, filled with whispers, gasps, and the sound of two souls becoming one. For Zara, this was more than just a moment of pleasure. This was a transformation, a revelation. Her body trembled beneath his hands, overwhelmed by sensations no male of her species had ever given her. Every touch, every movement, every breath was unlike anything she had ever known. And when it was over, when they finally lay together in the silence of the ruins, her body curled against his, her breathing still uneven, she whispered two words that sealed her fate. I'm yours. Karen ran a hand through her hair, letting out a slow breath. He had come to this planet as an outsider. Now he had something worth staying for, but deep down, He knew this wasn't the end, this was only the beginning. The warmth of the night still lingered on Zara's skin as she lay against Karen, their bodies tangled together in the dim glow of the ancient ruins. The world outside had felt distant, unimportant here in this moment. Nothing else mattered, but reality had a cruel way of creeping back. In a low, distant rumble shook the ground beneath them. It wasn't thunder, it was something else. Karen felt it first, his instincts honed from years of survival on a hostile planet. His fingers tightened around Zora's waist as he pushed himself up, his muscles still aching from their night together. Something's coming. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Zora's golden eyes snapped open, and a cold chill ran through her as she recognized the sound. No, her voice was barely a whisper. "The Countess." Karen was already on his feet, his mind racing. There was no need to ask who. A deep horn-like sound echoed through the ruins, followed by the distant clatter of boots against stone. Solara sat up, wrapping the silver fabric of her garment around herself as she stared at the shadows moving at the entrance of the ruins. Karen's knife was already in his hand. "Tell me how bad this is going to get." Zara swallowed hard. "If they have come for me, then my father knows." Karen didn't have time to curse. The first figure stepped into the chamber, a towering male clad in ornate obsidian armor, his expression carved from stone. His golden eyes flicked from Zara to Karen, darkening with disgust. "Zara," he said, his voice cold, emotionless, "you have brought shame to your bloodline." Zara slowly rose to her feet, her jaw tight. "I have brought nothing but truth." The warrior's gaze flickered to Karen. "You let a human defile you." His voice was thick with contempt. "You have ruined yourself." Karen let out a slow breath, flexing his grip on his knife. "I'm getting real tired of people acting like." She didn't have a choice. A second figure stepped forward from the shadows. Kith, the wound Karen had given him, was still fresh, a band of dark fabric wrapped tightly around his thigh, blood seeping through. But it wasn't pain that burned in his golden eyes, it was vengeance. Kith's lips curled back in a snarl. "I warned you, human." His fingers tightened around the hilt of his curved blade. "But now it is no longer my fight." The first warrior stepped forward, drawing his own weapon. "By order of the High Council, Zara is to be taken into custody." Karen's blood ran cold. Custody that wasn't just some meaningless punishment. It meant she was being branded as a traitor to her kind. Zora's breath hitched, but she did not back down. "I will not go with you." The warrior's eyes darkened. "Then you leave us no choice." Two more armored figures stepped into the ruins surrounding them. Karen's mind raced. Fighting them wasn't an option. He could take on one, maybe two. But this wasn't some drunken bar fight. These were elite warriors trained from birth to kill efficiently, and Zara was their target. A plan. He needed a plan. Zora's hand gripped his wrist, her claws lightly digging into his skin. Her eyes locked onto his, searching, pleading. She wasn't afraid. She had made her choice, and so had he. Karen exhaled. "All right, princess." His voice was quiet. "Just for her. Do you trust me?" Zara's golden eyes softened for the briefest moment. "With my life." Karen nodded, rolling his shoulders. And he acted in a single motion. He grabbed Zara by the waist and spun her behind him, shielding her with his body. His free hand shot to the hilt of the blaster holstered at his hip. The warriors reacted instantly, but Karen was faster. The first shot slammed into the nearest warrior's shoulder, sending him crashing backward into the stone. The second warrior lunged. Karen ducked low, twisting his blade upward in a quick, savage motion. Slicing across the alien's leg was already moving, his rage boiling over as he roared, "You'll die for this." Solara didn't hesitate. Before could strike, she spun, slamming her tail into his ribs with bone-cracking force. He staggered, coughing, his eyes burning with hatred. Karen grabbed Zora's wrist. "Run!" She didn't question him. They moved as one, dodging between the stone pillars, weaving through the ruins as the sounds of pursuit echoed behind them. Blaster fire sizzled past them, striking the walls. Karen pulled her forward, his breath ragged. "How do we get out of here?" Zara's mind raced. There was only one way. She turned sharply, leading him toward a hidden passage behind a broken pillar. It was narrow, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it led outside the ruins, past the city walls. Karen shoved her through first, following a second later. The moment they were outside, they were running again. The cool night air hit them like a shockwave. But there was no time to breathe, no time to stop. Zara's heart pounded. They couldn't go back to the trade outpost. They couldn't go anywhere her people controlled. There was only one place they could run: Karen's ship. She tightened her grip on his hand as they sprinted toward the city outskirts. The ruins faded behind them. But the danger did not. The hunt had begun. The pounding of their footsteps echoed against the deserted streets as Karen and Zara rac through the city's outskirts. The once bustling trade outpost now felt eerily silent, the only sound being their ragged breaths and the distant shouts of their pursuers. Karen's mind was moving fast, calculating their odds. They weren't good. They had speed on their side, but not time. And definitely not numbers. Zara clung to his wrist, her grip firm despite the desperation in her golden eyes. Your ship, she panted. If we can reach it, Karen already knew. We'll make it, he muttered, mostly to convince himself. They rounded a corner, darting into a narrow alley between two stacked metallic buildings. The distant hum of Karen's ship came into view, parked at the city's edge. Salvation was so damn close, but the universe had other plans. A bright blue energy bolt shot past them, slamming into the wall beside Karen's head. The impact sent a shockwave of heat through the air, making Zara stumble. Karen yanked her forward just as another shot rang out. They were being herded from the shadows ahead. 4 armored figures stepped into view. Their dark silver plates gleamed under the neon city lights, their weapons raised pulse rifles, standard issue for the High Council's enforcement units. Karen skidded to a stop. A second later, heavy footsteps echoed behind them. Zara turned, her breath catching. More warriors. Kith was among them, his lip curled in a smug, victorious sneer. They were surrounded. Karen exhaled sharply, eyes scanning for any possible escape. The buildings were too high to climb, and the alley was too narrow for a fight. They had nowhere left to run. Took a slow step forward, savoring the moment. This was inevitable. Human, his voice tricked with arrogance. You thought you could steal what belongs to us? Solara stiffened her jaw tight. I do not belong to you. Kiss smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but his rage returned just as quickly. You are blind. Your lust has poisoned your mind, he sneered at Karen, and your weakness has poisoned our bloodline. Karen rolled his shoulders, ignoring the searing pain in his wound. Funny, I don't feel weak. K's nostrils flared, but before he could lash out, the first armored warrior, the one who had spoken in the ruins, stepped forward enough. His voice was calm, commanding. K tensed, but did not challenge the authority in his tone. The warrior turned his gaze to Zara. By the will of the High Council, you are to be taken into custody. His golden eyes flickered to Karen. And the human will be executed. Zara inhaled sharply, her body going rigid. Karen let out a slow, humorless chuckle. You guys sure know how to make a man feel welcome. Zai stepped in front of him. You will not touch him. The warrior's expression remained unreadable. You cannot change the laws of our people. Her hands curled into fists. Then I renounced my people. A sharp silence followed. Even Karen's breath hitched. His eyes widened in shock before his expression twisted into pure rage. You would disgrace yourself for this creature. Zara lifted her chin. Yes. A growl rumbled deep in Kth's chest. Then you are dead to us. Before anyone could react, he lunged for her. Karen moved on instinct. In one swift motion, he grabbed Zara and shoved her behind him. His blaster, drawn in a blink, was fast, but Karen was faster. A sharp crack of energy rang through the air. Froze, then stumbled back, gripping his side. A burn mark sizzled through the metal plating of his armor, smoke curling from the wound. Karen exhaled, the weight of his master steady in his hands. Next shot goes between your eyes. The warrior shifted uneasily. Zara's breathing was ragged, but she stood her ground beside him. His gaze burned with fury, but he didn't make another move. The lead warrior studied Karen for a long moment before speaking. You would risk everything for her. Karen met his gaze, his grip on his weapon unyielding. I already have. The warrior tilted his head slightly as if evaluating him. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. Very well, snapped his head toward him. What? The warrior raised a hand. She has made her choice. His golden eyes locked onto Zara, and she will bear the consequences of it. Zara didn't waver. The warrior turned his gaze back to Karen. Take her, leave this place, and never return. Let out a snarl of protest. You cannot let them. Enough. The warrior's voice was sharp. She is no longer one of us. She is lost." Karen wasn't about to question their sudden mercy. His hand wrapped around Zora's wrist. "Let's go." She hesitated only for a moment, taking one last look at the people she had once called her own. Then she turned, her fingers tightening around Karen's. They moved fast, darting toward the edge of the city, toward his ship, toward their future. As they disappeared into the darkness, Car's eyes followed them, his lips curling into a whisper. "This is not over." The roar of the engine shook the ground beneath them as Karen and Zyra raced up the loading ramp of his ship. The sleek black hull of the vessel gleamed under the neon city lights, its thrusters humming with raw power. Zyra cast one last glance over her shoulder. Her people were gone. No one had followed them. Yet Karen didn't slow down. He slammed his palm onto the ship's controls, sealing the hatch behind them. With a loud hiss, the ramp retracted, the ship locking them inside. He exhaled sharply, turning to Zyra. "We're not safe." Yet she nodded, her expression steady but unreadable. Karen took off down the corridor, leading her toward the cockpit. The ship rumbled beneath them as the engines warmed up, its systems coming alive. Zyra followed in silence. Her steps measured, her golden eyes filled with something Karen couldn't quite place. He dropped into the pilot's seat, fingers flying over the controls. The ship's thrusters roared to life, the console flashing warnings as the city's airspace locked onto them. Security drones hovered in the distance, their sensors scanning. Karen gritted his teeth. Hold on. The ship lurched upward, its anti-gravity thrusters igniting in a violent burst. The force pushed Zyra against the wall, but she barely reacted. Karen maneuvered hard, dodging between two powering structures as warning sirens blared across the city. The comms crackled. "Unauthorized vessel, disengage your engines and return to port, or we will fire." Karen rolled his eyes. "Yeah, that's not happening." His fingers flipped the weapon switch, arming the ship's defenses. The targeting system locked onto the nearest drone. "Let's see how fast they are." The ship jerked into a steep climb, cutting hard through the air. Zara gripped the back of the co-pilot's seat, her breath catching as Karen navigated through a maze of towering spires. The first plasma blast from the security drones missed by inches. The second wasn't so lucky. A shockwave slammed into their hull, sending the ship into a sharp tilt. Alarms blared across the dashboard. Karen cursed, adjusting the stabilizers. Almost there, a sudden burst of energy flared behind them. The city's planetary defenses had locked on the targeting systems, were trying to box them in. Ken's hands tightened on the controls. "Come on, you piece of..." He yanked hard to the right, flipping the ship onto its side. The sudden motion sent Zara stumbling, but she recovered fast. The security drones closed in. Karen narrowed his eyes, waiting for the right moment. Now, with a quick flick of his wrist, he activated the ship's afterburners. A blazing trail of blue light shot from the engines as the ship exploded forward, breaking through the city's defense grid in a single violent burst. The sensors screamed warnings as they breached the upper atmosphere. The planet's gravitational pull fought to drag them back down. Karen gritted his teeth, forcing the ship to keep climbing. Then a sudden silence. The alarm stopped. The ship broke free. Space unfolded before them, a vast, endless black sea dotted with stars. Karen exhaled sharply, his muscles finally relaxing. They had made it. The ship drifted into the calm void. The city, them now just a distant memory. Karen leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "Well, that was fun." Zyra didn't respond. He turned to her. She was staring at the planet below, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Karen frowned. Laura, her golden eyes slowly met his. "It's gone." There was no sadness in her voice, no regret, just a quiet acceptance. Karen studied her for a long moment. She had just given up everything, her home, her people, her future, for him. A strange weight settled in his chest. He stood from his seat, walking over to her. "You okay?" She didn't answer right away. Then slowly she turned to face him. "I have no home." Her voice was soft. "No people." Karen's jaw tightened. "You have me." Zyra blinked, a flicker of something raw crossing her face. Then, without warning, she stepped forward, pressing her forehead against his chest. Karen froze. She had been so fierce, so confident, but now, in the aftermath of everything, she just needed to feel something real. His arms wrapped around her. Zyra let out a slow, shaky breath. "I belong to you now." Karen swallowed hard, his grip on her tightening. Yeah, he murmured, you do. They stood there wrapped in silence in the weight of what they had just done. But despite everything, Karen felt whole, and for the first time in her life, so did she. The stars stretched endlessly before them, a shimmering sea of silver light against the dark void. The hum of the ship's engines had settled into a low, steady rhythm, a heartbeat in the silence of space. Karen sat in the pilot's chair, one hand lazily draped over the controls, the other tracing slow circles against the smooth skin of Zara's arm. She sat beside him, curled against his side, her golden eyes half-lidded in quiet contentment. For the first time since they had met, there was no urgency, no running, no fear. They had escaped. They were free. Karen exhaled, tilting his head to glance at her. So, princess, what now? Solara smiled faintly, shifting against him, her tail wrapping around his leg in an unconscious show of affection and possession. We go wherever you go. Karen chuckled. You sure about that? I don't exactly have a 5-star travel itinerary. She tilted her head, studying him. Do you regret it? His smirk faded slightly as he looked at her, really looked at her, the woman who had defied her people, abandoned everything she knew, risked her life for a future that was uncertain for him. Karen let out a slow breath, reaching up to brush his fingers against her cheek. Not for a second. Zora's golden eyes softened, and for the first time, he saw something he had never expected: pure trust. She had no doubts, no hesitation. She had chosen him, and she would never look back. A slow smile tugged at her lips. Good. Karen leaned in, brushing a slow, deliberate kiss against her lips. It was different this time, not desperate, not rushed, just right. Zara sighed against his mouth, pressing closer, letting herself melt into the feeling, and for the first time in her life, she truly felt like she belonged. When they finally pulled apart, Karen flicked a switch on the dashboard, bringing up a holographic map of the galaxy. All right, he muttered, studying the display. Where do you want to go? Solara tilted her head, her golden eyes flickering with curiosity. Anywhere. Karen smirked, spinning the navigation dial. Anywhere. It is. The ship rumbled as the engines roared to life, the distant stars blurring into streaks of light as they jumped into hyperspace. And just like that, a new life began, a life of freedom, a life of adventure, a life where Sierra was no longer bound by duty, no longer caged by expectations, a life where she could finally truly be herself. And as she sat there, curled against the man who had fought for her, who had bled for her, who had given her a choice, when no one else ever had, she realized something. She had not lost everything. She had gained something far greater, a future, a love that would never fade, and the man who would stand by her side until the end of time. Solara smiled softly, resting her head against his shoulder. My human. Karen chuckled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. My alien. The ship soared through the void, leaving behind a world that no longer mattered, and together they disappeared into the stars. The end. Galaxy sparkles.